Hey everyone, Ryan here. Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios and to yet another long dormant series, Pedalhead. Today, Monger Instruments is back on the menu with the Green Slaad Overdrive. So if this is your first time stopping by or if you've not seen some of my more recent videos, Monger Instruments has been featured on a couple videos now, one of which was featuring a TC Electronics integrated preamp type pedal that also had Fort and Grind in 33 modes. That was primarily a pedal PCB design. The last time, though, was an original take on the venerable Rat circuit called the Magmin, and I like that pedal and what it was going for a lot, but it did not grab me the same way this one did, and that's why I'm giving this one the full pedal head treatment, and we'll be going through all the staples of this little mini series I've concocted. Again, if you've not seen this series before, there's going to be plenty of demos. We're looking at about 12, 13 minutes of pure audio, but there's also going to be a bit of an overview on the circuit. We're going to talk about some frequency response analysis, look how the pedal reacts at different settings, and I'll give you some of my favorite ways to use it and show you how it compares to some of the other similar pedals I have in my collection. Another thing to note, this is my pedal. I actually didn't purchase this one outright. It ended up being a product of a trade, but this is not a paid promotion. I have no reason to make this video other than I want to. A lot of YouTubers have problems stating that kind of stuff, so I'm just going to do that right now. Now, I'm sure some of you have already beaten me to the punch by looking at this pedal and thinking, why are we dedicating a whole video to another tube screamer? Because that's basically what this is. You see the gain, tone, volume controls, and it's a dead giveaway. This is indeed based on a classic TS9 or TS808 circuit. I had a shootout between the TS9 and SD1. We did SD1 derivatives. We've done overall shootouts between all kinds of, clipping, both hard clipping and soft clipping pedals. What's there more to say? Well, as it turns out, quite a bit, because just like the Magmin, this thing is loaded with a number of modifications that all kind of interact with each other in a way that produces tones you simply cannot replicate on a normal tube screamer circuit, although this one does a really good job at copying those tones as well. So we'll be going through and talking about all of that, of course, but I thought this would set the stage for some of the stuff that I wanted to do going forward on this series and hopefully within the next 4 or 5 videos. So let's take a brief walkthrough of this pedal's layout as I synopsize what all these controls do and how it affects the tone, and then you'll get to see and hear in real time what it does as I dial this in real time in front of a slightly overdriven amplifier. So first things first, mono ins and outs, nothing crazy there, 9 volt DC, but it actually steps up the incoming 9 volts to 27 volts via a charge pump. So increases headroom, which generally translates to more output volume, or at the very least, more headroom before stuff starts clipping. And you can definitely hear that in a couple of the modes on here. So that is one dated aspect of the tube screamer design that I think is improved. Gain, tone, volume, well, it does what these controls normally do, though you'll certainly see in some of our analysis how they differ from maybe a more stock version of these pedals. I will say the volume on this compared to something like an SD1 or the Wild Overdrives that are derivatives of that, or even slightly modified tube screamer circuits, this does appear to be a little quieter in the noon to maxed out range. I feel that unity gain is a little higher than I would normally expect it to be. That's not really a problem, as you'll see, given some of the modes this thing has to offer. Now, where stuff starts to get interesting is this blend clean control. Now, this is something that we saw on the Magman last time, and I've actually have had this on my Sparkle Drive mod. And what this does is essentially let you blend back in clean guitar signal. Now, there's a few ways of going about this, and I personally prefer where this control is placed on the Sparkle Drive more, though again, with some of the features of this pedal, it ends up not mattering so much. So on the Sparkle Drive, if you increase the clean blend control, you still get the effects of the output volume. So if you crank max volume and you crank the blend control to be your entirely clean guitar signal, it's still boosting your clean guitar signal. So they kind of have it situated like where it bypasses the clipping section, but it's before the output section. This basically bypasses the whole tube screamer circuit altogether. So you can have volume max, gain max, you can have a really crunchy pedal dialed in, but if you increase the blend control all the way to the point, or decrease it rather, to where it's only clean guitar signal, it's still unity gain. Now that can be a cool effect because you can dial in a really high output boost for one side and blend it that way. But personally, like I said, I prefer the other alternative. Still a good implementation because you can blend in a higher, crunchier signal and still retain some of the original pick attack or low end of the clean guitar. Again, that's not quite as important because the next control, the boost, kind of makes up for that. So this is a clean JFET boost that is activated via this foot switch, and you can use this all the time. You can use it as a solo boost, however you want. I find this to be a really cool tonal tool as well because you can certainly dial in the other part of this circuit rather clean or slightly overdriven and still maintain a full and I would say unperverted version of that sound when you boost it. You can also very much overdrive this section if you use some of the more higher output modes and slam it with a lot of gain and output volume and get some really wild, spitty, fuzzy sounds that you would not expect out of this. And of course, it's just more headroom, so you can slam the front end of an amplifier and get some cool natural tube breakup that way. These last two controls aren't exactly common on modified tube screamer circuits, but you do see them every now and again. The next row with these two controls are where things start to get kind of crazy. So the attack control. Some of you might look at this and be reminded of the Horizon Devices Precision Drive, which also has a control labeled attack. And it does fundamentally the same thing, where this is basically a high-pass control. In fact, if you look here on one of the promotional images, you can see the capacitor bank on the PCB that this control is selecting from. So we're essentially, as we move this control more counterclockwise, bringing in that filter more into the bass territory and tightening up the bass in front of the amplifier. So, if you have a really fat humbucker sound that you want to tighten up, or especially if you're playing an extended range guitar and you want to tighten the chugs, then this will help you do that. Now, the catch with that is that unlike some other, I would say, more common designs out there, this is actually exclusive to the gain section, which means that if you have gain at 0, the attack basically does nothing. And I would equate this to like the opposite of a bright cap on a gain potentiometer on an amplifier, where the more you crank the gain, the less the bright switch does something, and it's kind of the same thing in reverse here. But as you bring in the gain control, you'll hear this attack switch start to do something as more of the signal is routed through the clipping diodes or whatever elements there are, and it's filtering out more of the bass. So this is another thing where you're kind of constantly blending between a filtered, distorted signal and a clean signal, in addition to having this blend control here. So there's a lot of parallel processing going on in this pedal that makes things not so easily copyable and pasteable to someone else's pedal. You kind of have to do it guitar by guitar. So as you'll see for a lot of my demonstrations going forward, I will either have gain like completely maxed out and have the attack, kind of subtle in terms of how much I dial it in, or I'll have attack pretty aggressively dialed in and the gain dialed back, depending on my guitar. But of course, if you're, if you like the clacky gent sounds, then you can certainly, crank them both. Finally, on the bottom right, we see the return of a mod that I really liked on the Magman, which is being able to select the clipping elements. Now for this is soft clipping only, not hard or soft clipping, but you still get 7 different combinations, and actually 8 in total, where you bypass it altogether and you let the integrated circuit itself clip. So for like a traditional tube screamer, that would be symmetrical silicon diodes, where you'd pick a pair of diodes, they'd be the exact same thing, you'd face them kind of opposite directions in the circuit, and put those in the negative feedback loop. And as you turn up the gain control, you get more soft clipping distortion that way. On a Boss SD1, you'd have asymmetrical diodes where you'd either double up one or they would just be different voltages going across them. So you can automatically change the voicing and feel of this pedal through that and still be in the silicon diode territory. There's the same option, but also for germanium diodes, both of the symmetrical and asymmetrical varieties. I find these to be easily the softest distortion. In fact, you can hardly tell they distort at all. And quite frankly, I'm not a fan of symmetrical or asymmetrical germanium diodes in soft clipping. Obviously, the Klon uses those in hard clipping, and that's kind of a sound that I think works for that pedal as you kind of also blend between a clean and a distorted signal, but I'm not a huge fan of them on this design. What I am a huge fan of, though, are the LED modes, both, again, asymmetrical and symmetrical. These kind of have that crunchy Marshall in a box kind of sound. I know that many of the Marshall pedals and derivatives nowadays use a lot of LEDs, both of the red and green varieties, to get those kind of crunch tones. So there is something inherently British sounding about those modes. And then finally, MOSFETs, which the OCD uses in hard clipping. Now, if you don't want any of that, if you're a clean boost freak like me, you can go to the IC setting, which bypasses all of those clipping elements altogether and is easily the loudest mode, as you'll see coming up. And you can definitely get some distortion out of the op amp, but it doesn't really sound like hard clipping, doesn't sound like a traditional soft clipping pedal either. It's more amp-like, but still transistor-based. But with this, you can definitely turn the gain up higher and still get more output volume. Clean output volume is at that. And that's where something like the attack control can come in handy to be a clean bass cut. So I know I threw a lot of information at you, but hopefully as these demos will show, it's quite intuitive when you actually put it in front of an amplifier. Let's put some numbers and visuals to what you just heard so you can kind of categorize this pedal in your head as, doing stuff that other Tube Screamer derivatives do, but also show you how it derivates on those things as well. If I don't talk about the other controls, say, when I say gain 10, tone 5, volume 5, you can assume that it's in the symmetrical silicon diode mode. So like a regular Tube Screamer, the boost is off, the blend controls the entire distortion circuit, so as a normal Tube Screamer would be, and the attack switch is set to the all the way to the left here, counterclockwise, which probably, as you see on the figures, is letting in more bass than a normal Tube Screamer would, but that's just part of the process of making everything the same here. Our first slide here for show and tell demonstrates a couple important aspects about this pedal's design. So you'll notice there's a group of 3 lines up top and a group of 2 lines on the bottom. And what this basically shows you is that the volume control is what determines the overall output volume of this, which sounds obvious, but a lot of pedals increase in volume as you turn up the gain. And that's really not much the case with this one, because both settings with volume at 5, regardless of where the gain is, are pretty much the same output volume. The same thing with volume at 10. So you're getting your output volume almost exclusively from this control, where gain is almost exclusively distortion and compression, which is good. We want that kind of separation. You just don't see that a lot of the times in these kind of pedals. This is another kind of busy graph here, but it ultimately shows one thing, and that is when you kick on the boost, it's not perfectly linear. For the most part, it is. Once you get past about 200 hertz, whatever is, coming in is what's coming out, just at a higher volume. But as you can see down here in kind of the sub-octave territory, you're getting quite a decent roll-off on the low end, which you don't see when you turn up the gain control. Red to green here are the same settings, just with a higher volume, or because of the gain control being turned up. But when you turn on the boost mode, you lose a little low end, which, is totally fine for this kind of stuff. And in fact, for some of the higher gain settings I'll show going forward, it's actually kind of a good thing, because you roll off some of the more booming frequencies. But that's just probably one aspect of the JFET boost design that is inherent to that particular component. This figure is a little busy as well, and perhaps hard to comprehend, but it shows a few key points with the attack switch. So the loudest this pedal will get in pink is when you have, well, gain doesn't really matter, but volume maxed out and attack at minimum. So you're letting everything through, even if it's getting distorted or not. What happens though is as you turn on the attack, as you would expect, you filter out a lot of the low end, and so the pedal loses that kind of volume overall. So if you see gain 10, volume 10, A5, attack roughly in this position, then we filtered out a bit of the low end, but we've kept most of the high end. In fact, it's shifted over a bit because of the way the capacitor is doing its job. What gets interesting is as we lower the gain down to, say, gain at 5, but attack is all the way maxed out, it doesn't react exactly the same way. You're still filtering in back some of that bass content. So there's a lot of permutations where you can get the overall same frequency response at different clipping responses. Now, to really throw a wrench into things, all of the previous graphs you saw were dependent upon this pedal being set to symmetrical silicon diodes, but as you see here, that all kind of changes once you change the clipping mode. Now, for IC, it is obviously louder than everything. It has a fuller bass response, because as you are not letting the waveform being chopped off, then there's more waveform to escape the pedal. So it's going to be louder. The other pedals, though, retain a similar amount of bass response. It starts to deviate a little more once you get past about 100, 200 hertz. They all kind of start out similarly. The loudest below the IC is the asymmetrical LED mode, which is not surprising to me. That's kind of what I think of when I think of like a souped up tube screamer mod. I think the Plumes uses some of those. They might be symmetrical still, but LEDs are generally louder. Below that is the symmetrical LEDs, and then you start getting into the silicon diodes, the MOSFETs, which these things sounded louder to both me and Dirt Monger, but I guess it's because of the frequency response being a little more chewy and crunchy compared to some of the other ones. And then the germanium ones are just dead silent by comparison. Again, they don't do a whole lot to the circuit in terms of dirt, but they do take a lot away from it. So that's why I'm not the biggest fan of that mode. That brings me to the reason I wanted to try out this pedal in the first place. I almost never throw my money out at something without there being a purpose behind it. And the purpose for this was an attempt to replace two pedals that I have on my drive board, which is still kind of in flux, or else I would have shown it off by now. Stay tuned in the future. I'm sure there'll be a bit on that. But I'm using a combination of pedals to try to cover basically any and all dirt or drive tones that I would ever use in the overdrive category. There's a whole other can of worms to open up for fuzzes and distortions, that sort of thing. But I have basically a modified tube screamer circuit, and I have a Boss SD1 derivative circuit. And I was wondering, hey, can I kill two birds with one stone and then some? Because look at how many options we have to play with. That's just the first two here. So what I'd like to see in this next segment is how this pedal keeps up with a modified tube screamer circuit, a modified SD1 circuit, and one based on the Marshall Blues Breaker. Now that's one that I'm not really intending to replace, but with this being a more traditional, well, mid-hump tube screamer design, I did want to see how well it kept up with a more old school transparent overdrive and see if we could cop some of those sounds, considering this does have a blend control after all. So for the next segment then, let's hear the Green Slaad in its comparable settings next to a Voodoo Labs Sparkle Drive, an MXR Wild Overdrive, the first generation, and the Cherryatone Horsebreaker just on the breaker side, which is a Marshall Blues Breaker clone. The Slaad more or less meets my expectations here. The Tube Screamer circuit is one of those funny ones where it can attain the general idea of the sound you're going after, and it just kind of works. It's not like a really particular sound, even if you have a little bit more bass or a little more high end, or even the grittiness of the distortion quality isn't quite the same. To our ears, we're just, I think, at least in my opinion, we're just far less sensitive to this kind of circuit than something like a tube amplifier circuit would be. So because of that, I think both in the cleaner circumstances and especially once you stack it with tube amplifier gain, this covers all the bases I would expect out of a stock TS9 or an SD1 circuit. Now, it starts to fall apart a little bit once you put it against a blues breaker, but again, I'm not looking to replace that pedal, so that's totally fine. In fact, I'm pretty impressed that it keeps up as well as it did. Now, I'm sure if we crank the gain on all of these pedals, you would start to hear more of the differences. Even though this says symmetrical silicon diodes, there's no guarantee that these are the same kind of diodes that are used in the pedals it was going up against. Hell, there's no guarantee that if you chose the same kind of diodes, they would sound exactly the same because of the filtering and part tolerance and all that kind of stuff. But for what I'm expecting out of this pedal circuit, this gets a definitive pass in my book for this test. Though before we go into any more shootout segments, I would like to show off the other clipping modes on here. Now, you can certainly dial back the gain and use them in a more conventional tube screamer way, and I think that's a great way to do that, especially on like the LED and MOSFET modes. You get a different kind of crunch sound than your traditional diodes would in lower gain applications. But I want to show you what they sound like in just balls to the walls slammed mode. And with that, I will actually be activating the JFET boost on, I think, 3 out of 4 of these modes to show you how the interaction kind of plays together. And I want to get some sounds that you've probably never heard out of a tube screamer circuit once you put a clean preamp that is getting driven, and as well as some different clipping elements that are also getting driven to hell and back. Now, part of that will be the IC mode, which in and of itself is, again, not soft or hard clipping. It's just what the the integrated circuit is doing once it's overdriven. And for that, since it will be loud enough, I will disable the boost. So far, the Green Slaad has offered different takes on distortion modes than your run-of-the-mill tube screamer might. It may not have as much output volume or overall gain compared to some of the competition, but you can definitely compensate with that with this boost control and even get some cool overdriven tones out of that. You can filter this in ways that you certainly can't with competitors, and you can even blend back in your clean guitar signal. So far, this is looking like kind of a all-in-one do-it-all sort of pedal. Unfortunately for the Green Slaad, though, I already have a heavily modified tube screamer circuit on my pedal board, and if it's going to be dethroned, it's going to have to be by something that can outdo it in basically every way. So let's see if it can do just that. The Sparkle Drive has what I would consider 4 killer features over some of the competitors out there. First of which is a clean blend control, which this does, but we'll see if it keeps up in the same way. And then it has 3 mod modes. I'm not crazy about all of them, I'm not going to lie, and in fact, I think this does some cool stuff that the Sparkle Drive does not, but still, they were able to take a tube screamer circuit and do different things as well. So naturally, I just have to know if the Green Slaad can cover all the same bases as the Sparkle Drive mod, and maybe even sound better in some ways. Would I call those tones identical? Definitely not. Would I call them equivalent in the sense that they may have slight differences, but they don't affect audience perception or the feel of the pedal, and they at least serve the same purpose? Definitely, for some of those demonstrations there. And even a couple of the ones that this didn't necessarily match 100%, was it bad? No, it was just different. And in fact, I think, especially that mid-scoop mode the Sparkle Drive does, this sounded better. I'm not saying that mid-scoop mode wouldn't be better in front of a mid-heavy amplifier, but I liked the way that the mid-range honk of this pedal came out. And of course, it has all these clipping modes to offer that does not. And again, the distortion profile is going to be different just based on whatever clipping elements are used in that circuit that isn't here. So there's so many variables in all of this, but what I'm ultimately trying to get at, especially after that segment there, is that pick one, maybe two, if you're really crazy like me, modified tube screamer circuits, and you're pretty much going to do everything that you're going to care about, because there's some stuff that Sparkle Drive can do that this does not, and vice versa, but I'm not the kind of player that's going to use it. But before I share the ultimate fate of my Green Slaad, let's go over some of my favorite sounds that I discovered while using this pedal. And the first is a take on that traditional overdriven blues sound. And this isn't going to be as clean cut as just like, oh, dial in your gain here, tone here, volume there. You sound like Stevie Ray Vaughan now. Hooray. This one can definitely be serviceable with using some of the more traditional clipping modes, but the beauty of it is that you have way more options. But perhaps most impressively for me, this allows you to dial in tones that don't really sound like they're coming out of a pedal. Sounds like an all-in-one package, which are among my favorite pedal tones, when you can't tell that it's a pedal. You wonder, what kind of boutique amplifier or modifications they're doing. It's like, oh, well, we just stacked some diodes on top of it and it sounded good. So this is right in that wheelhouse of, turn it on, you go from silky, smooth clean to, soft compression, edge of breakup lead sound. Another one of my favorites that really showcases the potential of this circuit, the Gent Boost, I guess. Turn the clipping mode to IC. You can optionally have the JFET boost on. I will, just to achieve some stupid output volumes. Blend all the way, for this one, we'll want the entire circuit in the path. Volume as high as you can get it, or as you want it, without, making the boost fart out, or the front end of your amplifier for that matter. And this is where we'll actually be able to crank the gain higher, because not only is there more output volume and higher headroom with this IC before it starts clipping, but that will allow us to take advantage of the attack switch. And this will be useful to, dial in a low tuned guitar, especially a 7 or 8 string, and turn this into a really capable, I wouldn't say clacky. I don't like when, people cut all the bass out. There's a fine balance, but something that, tightens up even the front end of something like a rectifier. What this will also allow you to do, if you have too much high end going into your amplifier and things are starting to sound a little nasally, you'll be able to turn down the tone control and make a more tighter, mid-focused sound that way, which again can become too nasally if you go too far. But I find this is an interesting balance when you take out a lot of the bass, but then don't turn up the tone too much. Finally, the always-on rhythm boost with optional lead boost. This is particularly useful for those players out there that might use something like a hot rodded Marshall circuit or a rectifier or a 5150, and they like to tighten up the front end with a more traditional tube screamer circuit, but then they don't really want to change it too much for their lead sound. You just need a little bit more, whether it be 10, 12 decibels of boost. This will allow you to do that. So what's cool about this is, as we've seen, as you turn on the boost, you can kind of get a cool saturation thing and flatten out the frequency response. And I think that plays nicely with the higher frets of any guitar. So I'll add some effects in post, of course, but for those that like, their baseline rhythm sound and just want to kick its ass when you're going in for a lead, I think this can be a great solution to have your always on rhythm stomp and then hit that when you need it for leads. As we wind down this video, what is there to say about the Green Slaad then? Well, for me personally, the pedals I'm using right now on my overdrive board for that symmetrical and asymmetrical clipping diode pedal job are not going anywhere. I like the output volumes. I like the mods they have to offer. I like the gain structures. I just like those pedals. So unfortunately, they're not going to get replaced by this anytime soon. However, I don't think I'm going to get rid of this either because, man, it does some stuff that you don't hear. And even though I may not use this on a mainline board, I do want to have this kind of pedal as one of those like, oh, go get that thing if you need it. Kind of the same way of like an integrated preamp or, a dedicated fuzz pedal. Like it's one of those 1 out of 20 times, but hey, when you need it or you want to play with it, there you go. And that's directly attributable to all these modifications and the intricacies that you can do with this pedal in terms of dialing in different sounds. For me, I would recommend Dirk Monger take a different path, or at least a streamlined path with his modifications. The selections are really cool, especially like on the Magman with the soft hard clipping stuff. The truth of the matter is, to me though, is not all of it is the best thing to showcase, or they just sound like some of these mods, the germaniums especially, they just don't sound like anything compared to some of the ones that are offered up here. So I would have, a more stripped down selection. Even if you just got rid of those, I think that's completely acceptable. And, I think a smaller footprint and definitely a lower price on this would be more attractive to some people, but you got to charge what you got to charge for whatever it's actually worth in time, labor, and parts. The boost feature is an absolute must. Keep that. I think some people would like to see a before and after, just, whether you boost the front end or boost the back end. Me, I like it where it is, but, some people would think that. And I also would like just more distortion, more gain on some of these. Again, you can change that with some component choices and, just dialing in different circuits. But it's a hell of a start, and I'm very interested to see what can be done with a V2 on the Magman and the Green Slaad. But for now, I'll definitely be hanging on to this, and I would expect to see this on the channel going forward. Maybe not all the time, but again, for one of those, and when I need it kind of occasions. So we'll see you on the upcoming episodes of Pedalhead, whenever that will be. I've got too many things to go over for one more season, but we'll try to squeeze in everything I can, and I hope you got some entertainment and infotainment out of this as always. Let me know down below what you think, and if you have any other suggestions, we'll see you next time. Bye.